Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer, and welcome to another Quest by Community. And today we have an astounding guest for us, someone who's just recently published a fantastic book that I just can't put down, and that is Professor Noah Riseman, who's just completed this wonderful journey exploring our trans history in Australia and the impact of the for this on the trans and gender community. Noah Riseman is an accomplished professor in the areas of history, and welcome to our show today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Ricky. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you.
Let's begin this incredible journey. What made you sort of come to the realization that it was time to write a his book of our living history?
Wonderful question. And obviously, I do acknowledge that I'm coming to this as a cisgender male who was doing this research. So I come to it as an outsider. What brought me to it is that my previous project was looking at the histories of LGBTIQ plus people in the Australian Defence Force. And when I did that project, I interviewed about a dozen trans members of the Defence Force, give or take, past and present. And one thing that was really clear from those interviews was you couldn't understand the experiences of trans people in just one institution like the Defense Force without knowing the much broader contexts and broader histories. So, the social, the medical, the legal. And at the time we didn't have a history of trans people in Australia. Over dinner, I asked two very good trans friends of mine what they thought, and they were like, "Yes, please, we need this project." So I, started the research from there. Very much was trying as best I could to work in partnership with communities throughout the process to make sure that everything that I was researching and writing was being ethical, was being responsive, and where possible, affirming trans voices and sort of trying to keep my editorializing to a minimum.
And how did you approach the research process for this book? In specific terms, what sources did you consult and what methodologies did you employ to gather the information and data?
A lot of my training is as an oral historian. So I always knew that, as I said, wanting to affirm trans voices, that oral histories were going to be huge part of this book. But that said, living memory only goes back to about the 1950s, and even then, it's there's very few older trans people who were able or willing, let's say, to be interviewed who could really talk about before the 1980s. But so from the period of from about the 70s onwards, a lot of it is oral history based. But it wasn't just oral histories. So for that earlier period, from the early 20th century, a lot of it came from newspapers that you was able to access through Trove, which is available from the National Library of Australia. For the whole period, the Australian Queer Archives were incredibly helpful, located at the Pride Centre here in Melbourne. And anyone who's dealt with them before knows they're run by an army of volunteers who are just so devoted to preserving and disseminating histories of the whole rainbow community. But also, one thing that was incredibly unexpected, but one of the most valuable sets of sources that I came across was quite a few of the people I interviewed had saved like everything from their entire lives in personal archives. The example I go to the most, although it wasn't just her, is Dr. Julie Peters, who she had saved everything in her life going back to her primary school report cards. But what Julie had also saved was anytime she came across a newspaper or a magazine or any article with stuff relating to gender or transgender, she saved it and she organized it in filing cabinets. And so she had all of these old media pieces. She had records from organizations she had been involved with that very few institutional collections had. And she wasn't the only one. There were other people who had saved all sorts of stuff that hadn't been archived anywhere. So, I mean, there were other little bits here and there, but the main source base for this project was a mix of oral histories, personal archives, and also media and institutional archives.
Could you give us some insights into the historical context of trans experiences in Australia? Were there any specific shifts or pivotal moments that have shaped the current understanding of trans history in this country?
I'll try and pull out a few things. One is I should say that the book starts in 1910, and I don't use 1910 as arbitrary year, and it's not meant in any way, shape, or form to deny gender diversity before 1910. We know that since time immemorial, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures here have had people living in third or non-binary genders and experiences of gender crossing. The reason 1910 is because that's when the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld coined the term transvestite. And I know that nowadays that term is considered very outdated and offensive. That's why I use quotation marks. But that at the time was the first language that used trans in the language. And I do have to say, by the way, just for anyone who's watching, if you can get past the fact that the book uses that word, it is actually really good even by today's standards. Like Hirschfeld explores all sorts of different reasons why people dress in and use gender expression that's different from their sex assigned at birth. It's actually really, really relevant today. Just obviously the term is no longer used. Now, anyway, that term doesn't really take off in Australia until the 1930s. And even then, it's only in very small medical and psychological circles that you begin using it. Where you really begin to see a shift then is after the Second World War, when the American GI Christine Jurgensen has gender affirmation surgery in Europe. This makes global headlines, including in Australia. And that sort of a recognition that gender affirmation surgery is now a possibility, as well as there's new language emerging around, again, outdated term, but transsexualism, creates sort of opportunities, let's say, or it creates a language and it creates a way that people who already were experiencing um, gender struggles or internal questioning about their gender can suddenly look and go, there's a word for what I'm experiencing. Not only is there a word, there are others like me. This isn't just me. This is real. So that I think is an important turning point, is finding that language. In the 1970s, there's more turning points in that we see the emergence of the first trans organizations. The first one being Seahorse, founded in Sydney in 1971 by Rosemary Langton. In Victoria, we see trans activists like the Victorian Transsexual Coalition emerging in the late 70s. You see in Sydney a sort of shift from just trans support groups to activism in the early 80s under the leadership of Roberta Perkins, which leads to setting up Tiresias House. Talking turning points again in the 90s, we see the language shift again and understandings shift again as the word transgender becomes more common, and we begin to start seeing gender not just in binaries, and also not just being about medical intervention. So the activists of the 90s start saying, well, transgender is this umbrella word for anyone who identifies with a gender other than their sex assigned at birth, regardless of whether they want or have had surgeries. And then I think in the 2000s, and then especially into the teens, you see a lot more visibility. And I would dare to say, and I genuinely believe there's a lot more acceptance as well. That said, as we've seen in the last few years, with more acceptance also comes more backlash and a lot more vocal anti-trans, which of course we're grappling with today. So sorry, that was a long answer to your question because there's just so much to it, Ricky. I don't know if you want to delve into any of that more deeply.
Really fascinating, and I guess for me, it's that, and for people listening, this book will really allow us to really kind of dig deep and kind of look at some of the trajectories and pockets of time that have really shaped who we are and how where we are now in 2023. And I guess for me now, I'm just wondering to know, were there any obstacles that you faced or challenges when you were putting all this together?
Oh, that is such a good question. So there were, and everything I'm about to share, I don't say in a bad way, because probably every obstacle, if we want to use that word, was a learning experience for me. So again, cis white guy as an outsider, wanting to work with the community, needing to make sure that I do my best to work as an ally and not speaking for the community, but also building relationships. And for the most part, that went well. But there were a few times where there were some people who just didn't like the idea of a cis guy doing this. And I totally respect that. I mean, I get that. So there were some people who didn't want to participate in interviews, and that's totally fine. Language was very much a challenge. We know that identities are something that's very personal to people in how they identify and the language that they choose for themselves. I, where possible, was trying to use best practice, most up to date language. TransHub didn't exist when I started this, but TransHub did come along and I found incredibly useful. But very early on in the project, I, in my information letter to participants, used a word that I did not realize at the time was actually an offensive term. And one person who I had approached for an interview got very angry when she saw that and chewed me out. And again, rightfully so. But once we had a conversation, she did realize it was an honest mistake on my part. And I apologized. And as I said, it was a learning experience. I changed the language. I haven't used that word since. There have been other people along the way who they do themselves identify with some of the terms that we now consider outdated. And one thing I've always said to people is it's not my place to tell anyone how to self-identify. I don't think it's anyone's place to tell anyone how to self-identify, but I'm trying to use the most up-to-date preferred terminology where possible. Those people were relatively understanding about that. And I think another challenge was when finally putting this all together, anyone whose interview I quoted from, I did contact just to make sure, said, I just want to make sure, are you okay with how I've used this excerpt, how I've presented your story? Some people got back to me and were like, yep, totally fine. Some people got back to me and said, can you just make these minor changes? Like, yep, totally fine. There were a few people who got back to me and said, this, at least one stands out in particular who was like, what are you doing? This is awful. How dare you? Blah, blah, blah. We did have conversations, and the conversations, they were very positive, and I said, what do you want me to change? Just tell me what I've got wrong here. And, literally like did the typing then and there with them, sent it to them, and they're like, yes, this is much better. Thank you. And look, again, I'm not criticizing that. That's part of the process of doing this ethically. And it's a stronger book because of that. And also, the people who were in the book, I hope feel as though I've affirmed them accurately by virtue of doing that. But it's a lot of people, I guess. That's to say, interviewed over 100 people. Not all 100 interviews made it into the book because it just wasn't possible, but a lot did. So that was a lot of people I had to go back to.
And I guess that I wonder when you were as mentioning the 100 people that you interviewed, was there a difference in age ranges, or was it over a certain age that you were kind of focusing on?
The age ranged from the youngest person I interviewed at the time that I interviewed them, they were 20. So I don't know how old they would be now. They're not 20 anymore. And the oldest person was 89 the time that I interviewed them. So it was quite a range. I would say that the majority, oh, maybe I shouldn't say majority. Look, because it was a mix of activists, advocates, some health practitioners and allies, but a lot of people who, and I use the word very loosely, of course, a lot of very ordinary people. So for that reason, it was a huge age range. But I guess by virtue of it being a history book and being especially interested in some of the more prominent activists and advocate stories, there were probably more people who were, aged 40s, 50s, and above, I suppose I'd say.
And one thing that I've always struggled with in my life, and I'm sometimes even challenge myself to write about it, and that's the aspect of passing. And I'm just wondering if within your interviews that there was any conversations about the different experiences of some women who um, were consumed by that of passing, whereas others still sort of thought, "No, here I am. Take me as I am."
And I would say this applied to trans men as well. But look, it did come up primarily. I'm thinking out loud here. I'd have to. I mean, hopefully I'm accurate when I say this. I think it primarily came with some of the older women, or not. Maybe older is not the right word, but trans women and men who transitioned pre 2000s. And part of that, I think it's for multiple reasons. One reason is genuine safety, is how it's put. Like, we know even today that trans people face hate crimes in disproportionate numbers to many other parts of the community. That's today. Now let's imagine 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50. it was dangerous. So, I mean, and I know that term passing is controversial in the community, but so let's say trying to not be visible, to be able to blend in with cis society was in part a safety issue, and people did talk about that. For others, it was also the way that the medical authorities sort of regulated, if regulate, yeah, regulate, let's go with that word. We'll go with the word regulate. Regulated access to affirming care, access to gender affirmation surgery, access to hormones, the ability of someone to fit stereotypical physical appearances of masculine or feminine was a huge influence on that. So, quite a few people who went through medical transitions in the 1980s or the 1990s talked about how when they went to present to the psychiatrist, they had to, if they were trans women, they had to wear skirts and they had to, appear very feminine. One that stands out, I remember Sally Goldner told me like that she and a friend of hers nicknamed the outfits that Sally had to wear Moneypenny suits, like Miss Moneypenny from James Bond. So they were those suits that were just feminine enough. And so, but there was this sort of, if you wanted to get access to hormones and gender affirmation surgery, and I say that acknowledging not every trans person wants that, you had to fit those stereotypes of passing for the doctors to be willing to give it to you. So that's another reason that quite a few people did. But also, look, there were people who, you know, society imposes on all of us sort of stereotypes of what is feminine, what is masculine. And a lot of people subscribe to that, including trans people. And again, I don't say that in a bad way, but that for those people, fitting that stereotype was very important to them. And so yes, that's another long answer to your question because every question is complicated, isn't it? Especially when every individual has a different life experience.
Mm. How do you describe the impact of your findings in relation to the broader field of trans history? Are there any specific contributions you feel that your book makes to the scholarly conversation?
There's no easy way to answer this without coming across as tooting my horn here, Ricky. So thank you for the trap. But look, there have been some great trans histories coming out, primarily from the U.S. actually. So Susan Stryker's book on trans history, the first edition of it came out, I'm pretty sure in 2008, if memory serves, and she had an updated edition. I think it was 2017. Um, Susan Stryker's book was absolutely groundbreaking, really good book on American trans history. And actually going back even before Susan Stryker, now that I think about it, Leslie Feinberg, who was a trans activist from the US as well, wrote a book in the 90s on trans history. So those two have sort of written some groundbreaking texts. There are other texts from the United States that focus on particular aspects or particular periods of trans history. So there's some work that's been done on people who were cross-dressers in San Francisco in the late 1800s. There's been work on the histories of gender affirmation surgery in the United States. There's been work on histories of trans children going back to the early 20th century in the United States. Recently, there's been some work about sort of discourses and language about sort of transness and blackness in the United States going back to the 1800s. So there's been quite a lot of scholarship coming out of the United States. Less so in other parts of the world. The UK, there is one book by Christine Byrne. There it is. That's come out of the UK. Only one, and it's a really good book. In terms of Australia, there have been some journal articles and some book chapters that have looked at particular moments or figures in Australian history who gender crossed. And there is one really excellent book that I recommend by Lucy Chesser called Parting with My Sex, where what Lucy Chesser did was she looked at examples from the mid 1800s till about 1920 of people who, of newspaper reports of people who were caught gender crossing. And Lucy's very cautious not to impose the label trans on them because A, the word didn't exist, and B, we don't know what these people's identities were. But she very much does look at the way that these experiences of gender crossing um, expressed anxieties about sex and gender and sexuality in Australia. But to go back to the beginning of what I was saying, this book that I've written is the first full length book that really takes a broader, more comprehensive approach to Australian trans history from the early 20th century till today.
What can readers expect to gain from reading this incredible book? Are there any key takeaways that you aim to impart for your audience?
Well, takeaway number one, trans people, or let's say gender diverse people, because that term trans hasn't always been around. They've always been here and they always will be here, no matter what the anti trans movement wants us to think. Um, but also, the big thing also I would like people to take away is this community has always been diverse. Community might not even be the right word. Communities is probably a good word, but even those communities in their diversity have evolved and they've changed over time. And people have always been looking for different ways to navigate their life, to navigate their gender journey, and to express themselves. But one thing that's been consistent along the way has also been fights for legal recognition and fights for access to healthcare, but basically fights to be allowed to live their lives as they want. That has been a consistent along the journey. I think some of the anti-trans movement, well, not just some, a lot of the anti-trans movement likes to claim that it's a fad, it's a new thing. Like, no, it's not. It's they've always been here. It's just people are now speaking up a lot more, being a lot more open about who they are, and that's a wonderful thing. And yeah, let's hope they keep doing that.
Looking ahead, do you believe that there are still gaps in our understanding of trans history in Australia? And are there any specific areas or themes that you would love to see future researchers explore?
Absolutely. Look, as a historian, I mean, the short answer is every area of history, there are always more gaps and more areas to explore. But I would say, in this context, trans history, of course, I'm not the final word on this. Are you kidding me? Like, I'm one of the opening shots, let's say, on this. And there's a lot more trans histories to write by trans people, by allies. I think one area and I acknowledge this, especially even having written this book, that we absolutely need more historical research is on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Now, I did absolutely make a conscious effort to include interviews, perspectives, stories, histories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Some of it is weaved through the narrative in the book, but also I have a chapter specifically about that. But there is a lot more to say about sister girls, brother boys, and gender diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob. There's a lot more to say about non-white / European communities, be they Pacifica people or from Southeast Asia or South America or wherever. So there's a lot. Look, I acknowledge that's one area that I've done my best in the book, and I hope that I've done it justice. But I acknowledge there needs to be a lot more in that space, and other spaces as well. I mean, another one, trans men. So a lot of the people I interviewed and a lot of the experiences I came across of trans men only really went back to the 1990s. Now, there were some isolated examples before the 1990s that I've certainly written about and put in here, but I think there's obviously been trans men longer than since the 1990s. Just the 1990s is when they began to organize and began to be more visible and began to more open. And non-binary histories as well. It's another one. I actually got asked by a scholar somewhere else if I could give them more information about non-binary history. And the short of it was, in the 90s was when there were some activists, Nori being one of the more prominent, and Adi Griffin, both out of Sydney, who were challenging binaries. They weren't using the language of non-binary because that term sort of didn't come, but they were challenging binaries in the 90s. It's in the 2000s and then the teens that you begin to see much more visibility. But of course, there would have been non-binary people before the 1990s. So yeah, sorry, that's just a few examples of where there's scope for more research. But I mean, on any topic in trans history, LGBTIQ plus history in general, there's so much more work to do and so much more scope for community members and scholars to uncover these histories.
What an incredible journey that you've taken us. Now, in terms of the actual book, how can people get a copy of the book?
You can order through Melbourne University Press's website or from any good bookseller. I personally encourage anyone to patronize independent booksellers and, where possible, LGBTIQ plus booksellers. Encourage your libraries to to purchase it if they haven't already, because we'd love to see this available in libraries. And it is also available as an ebook, which you can definitely order the ebook through the Melbourne Uni Press website. I'm not sure how ebooks work with libraries. I have to be very honest. I know my university library certainly they order ebooks all the time, so I assume that any library can order an ebook, but it does exist as an ebook.
I guess for us, the importance of ebooks for young people who are trans and gender diverse to kind of get a bit of an understanding of what has happened and took place would be able to access your book um, in a library safely because we have to remember that some people in the community, and it's not just an age thing, it could be that they're not feel safe enough to have a hard copy to explore, can actually look at something that's online safely in a space that's comfortable. And that's the beauty of this book and this publication. Do you
And
see
actually, Ricky, if you don't mind me jumping in there, one thing I would say is I know we're promoting the book today, but for people who want to know more and freely accessible, about a few years ago, I wrote a report called Victoria's Transgender History that was published on. It's free. Like I believe that the work we do as historians needs to be accessible to the communities that we work with. Obviously, when you publish something, publishers need to make money. That's fair and reasonable. That's why this is for sale. That's why I'm encouraging libraries. But I would say that free resources out there. The Victoria's Transgender History Report is available freely on. It was available on the Transgender Victoria website. I think it's not at the moment, but if you Google it, you can actually find the link. And I also wrote a report on New South Wales trans history, which is freely available to download both through TransHub and through the Gender Center website. So obviously, this book is national, so it's got the stuff that's in those reports and more. But those are also free resources that I'd encourage people that you can look at. Is those reports, one through Transgender Victoria, one through ACON and the Gender Center.
Professor Riseman, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us on Quests by Community.
Thank you, Ricky. It's always a treat to talk to you.